Hi, welcome to episode 70 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whitten, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. April Chatham-Carpenter, who lives about 1,080 miles southwest of me in Little Rock, Arkansas, where she is the chair of the Department of Applied Communication at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. April, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Absolutely. I love that you always start these podcasts out with how far you are from us. Uh, and hopefully you'll get to come to Arkansas someday if you haven't already.
Yeah,
It's a beautiful, beautiful place.
that'd be
So a
great.
little bit about my story. I actually grew up in Oklahoma and Arkansas, so kind of used to this South kind of culture, and went to school, did all of my basically K through 12 in Arkansas, and then college in central Arkansas in a town called Conway. It used to be the State Teachers College, and it became the University of Central Arkansas. And then I moved back to Oklahoma and got my master's and PhD at the University of Oklahoma. So I'm a big Sooner fan. Um, so even sometimes when we're not doing well in football, at least our softball team is good most days. And so anyway, and then I took my first teaching job at the University of Northern Iowa, which was in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And I lived while I was there in a small community of about 10,000, a kind of a bedroom community outside of, and more rural outside of the Cedar Falls and Waterloo community area. Thought I would probably retire there. I loved teaching. It was my first teaching job, but the winters were a little brutal. And my husband always said, "Can we move back south?" And I'm like, "Well, south where?" And he was from Illinois, on the Illinois side of by St. Louis. And so he's like, "That's not south enough. It's still too cold." And I'm like, "So you don't like any snow?" And he's like, "No." I said, "Well, I love the snow." He says, "Well, I hate the shoveling." And I'm like, "Okay, so get that." Um, my first
His trump card.
my first season in Iowa, I got so excited because we could actually walk through the snow and it looked like a fort. And I'm like, who knew there were things that blew snow to make it look like a fort? I'm like, what are those things called? Snow blowers. Didn't even know what they were, because my mother in Arkansas, when I grew up in Arkansas, she would have me actually, if it ever snowed, she didn't ever know if it was going to last overnight through the next morning. And so she would wake us up in the middle of the night, and we would actually have to go play in the snow. Have to, because we don't know if the snow's going to last.
Ah,
And when we would oftentimes then go over the holidays back to Oklahoma to visit my dad's family and my mom's family, we would get so excited because sometimes it would be snowy on the way to back to Oklahoma City, which is where they both lived. And so anyway, I ended up finding a job back in central Arkansas. My parents had by that point both passed away. And so I moved back here in 2015 and came back really not to Little Rock because I loved Little Rock. I really had never, I had some memories of Little Rock as a kid, which I can share if it's appropriate later. But
sure.
I didn't know much about the city. And in the university here is a metropolitan university. And I was used to a more residential university, where kind of a destination campus as opposed to a metropolitan campus, which people are coming and going, and not as much campus life. No football team is the key to make the difference between
Uh,
the two.
uh,
We have other sports, but not a football team. And so thus in Arkansas, people go for the Razorbacks because we don't have any kind of national level, NFL or other kinds of teams here.
mhm.
So anyway, I thought I would live in Iowa forever, but moved back to Arkansas, fell in love with the state that I thought I would never come back to. And yeah, I'm teaching in a department of applied communication, which most people don't have a clue what that means, but maybe we'll get into that if it's appropriate. So
Yeah, no, I was torn when I was looking at when I was thinking about today. I'm like, do I want to dive right into what is applied communication, or do I want to dive right into like Arkansas and your whole slice of the country? And I guess we'll start with the latter, which is where we already are. So when you were living, living away from Arkansas, did it change your perception of Arkansas, like one way or the other, having been removed for so long?
Some. I mean, I kind of stayed a little bit connected to what was going on in the state because my parents and my sister, and most of my niece and nephews lived in Arkansas. So I would stay connected through them about some of the things that were happening. I my this will tell you what my age is, but I have a picture of me, and this is kind of a not directly answering the question, but it's kind of a funny story of going to um, the Capitol when Bill Clinton was governor, and
Oh
I was a
wow.
junior in high school at the time, and I have a picture of myself with him as governor, and so that'll kind of tell you. And my parents were staunch Republicans, and so and did not like Clinton either as governor or president, and so that kind of tells you a little about how I grew up in terms of political things, which may be something we talk about later if you want to.
Mhm.
But in terms of Arkansas, the funny thing is that the conversation I remember having was with a person that was at my school in Iowa, and they found out I was moving back here. And they grew up in Louisiana, and they started telling me all of the reasons why Arkansas was bad. And I'm like, I didn't ever have those stereotypes of Arkansas people. Didn't think of myself as that kind of uneducated mentality. I knew when I moved and I don't think that's true of Arkansans in general, but we do have some issues with education or have had in the past. But when I moved to Iowa, one of the things I was really impressed with was the school systems and how their test scores were really good. And I thought, I was single at the time. I thought if I ever raised kids, this would be a really good place to raise kids because, and I never thought that Arkansas wasn't. I just didn't think about those kind of things because that wasn't where I was, and I had a good education. So I didn't think about that. So my parents, though, when they got ready to move to Arkansas, my dad's mother came from pretty wealthy. Uh, a family that was pretty wealthy in the Alabama area, and when she ended up, my grandmother married into kind of poverty
Mhm.
in Oklahoma, and when she found out that my parents were moving to Arkansas for the first time, so this would have been when I was 5 years old, 6 years old, she thought they don't wear shoes there, do they? I mean, they don't have any kind of income. What are you all taking my grandchildren to? And so there was the stereotype even back then of what Arkansas was like. And so I didn't appreciate the state though until I moved back. I didn't know the nature, the history. I think living in it sometimes as a kid, you don't take advantage of those things and you don't think about them. But as an adult, I began to start seeing what are my daughters were in seventh grade and going into seventh grade and ninth grade, and my husband, none of which had ever been in Arkansas, had any connections to Arkansas except for my side of the family, and so I had to like what am I taking them to? That was the question. I had a conversation with my youngest daughter when I was talking to her about, I really believe this is, how God wants us to be moving here. And she's like, Mama, are you sure you've been hearing from God right? Because I am not feeling it. Now, she hated me for a couple of years and now says that moving to Little Rock was one of the best things that ever happened to her, several years later. But she really, it was not a good move
Mhm.
for her in seventh grade. So let's just say that she had a different perception until probably the last 2 years when she's to realize how good it is.
Mhm.
So
Well, how old is she now? Is she still in
she's
school?
20. She's
Okay.
20.
All right.
Yeah, and interesting. She's moved to Oklahoma to go to school. So I'm like, okay, you just make sure you pick the right school there. But she ended up picking Stillwater. I'm like, that's the wrong color. What? I have to buy orange instead of big red. I'm like, anyway, sorry, don't get me going down that road.
There's lots of different like kind of cultural like differences that I get to when I talk to people, and one of those is like kind of the allegiance to universities. Because I mean, I think people are aware of it, and in different respects, they might have their allegiances or their snobbery. But I think the visceral kind of athletic supporter type thing is not something that we can necessarily relate to in the same way, because there's just, you don't have those big state schools around here to get behind
Yeah,
like
well,
that.
that's true. I mean, you have like national level teams
Yeah.
that are professional. So
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. And I wouldn't have liked. I mean, just because I went to Oklahoma University and I wasn't a Sooner because of that. I was a Sooner because my dad
Hmm.
was a Sooner.
Uh,
He was an alum of there for many years prior. And every Saturday, wherever we were traveling, he would turn on the radio to have us listen to football. So here I knew the rules of football because my dad, he didn't have a boy, but my sister and I both have talked about that. That didn't matter because we both love football,
hmm.
and so we will stop everything to watch. Now she's a big Razorback fan. I never have really I'm into the Razorbacks, but I'm still my allegiance is really to Oklahoma.
Uh-huh.
So that's not going to be good when Oklahoma joins the SEC in the next couple of years. So who am I going to be going for? When they're playing Arkansas if they do.
Yeah. So, and yes, did you like? Did your daughter have the same perception or expectations of Arkansas that like your grandmother did when the family was originally moving there? Like, what was it that had her hesitating?
Yeah, so for her, she had some really good friends, and we were living in a small town, and we were then moving to a larger city. So, moving from a town of 10,000 people, um, where the most exciting thing to do on the weekend is to go to the adjacent town to go to
Hmm.
the mall. Then going to here, where people drive like there are no traffic rules.
Ah.
And she was also going to have to be learning to drive, and I mean there was a lot of fear connected to
Hmm.
there, but we made a decision, and I will say, this is a decision that, I made some decisions. We made decisions, and always as parents, you think about what could I've done differently that I probably would do differently now. But we made a decision to send both of our daughters to a private school
Hmm.
because I had heard that the school system in Little Rock wasn't great at specific levels. There were some levels that were good: elementary, great; high school, fine; but the middle school, junior high, and I just what we were just concerned about. And so I look back on that now, and here's the impression that she got because we went to a private school. She at one point said to me, "Mom, why is it that we are so poor?" Now, you understand, I and don't consider myself poor. I'm middle class. My husband and I are both employed. He's a chaplain at a local hospital, and I've got a teaching job and an administrative kind of teaching job. So I told her, I said, "We're not poor." She said, "Mom, in comparison to the people I'm going to school with, we're poor." And so she began to get an impression of Arkansas and Little Rock in particular that led her to see socioeconomic status differences in ways that were totally unexpected to me. I had never hung out with rich people, never grew growing up, never. I mean, I guess I did at some level. My mother would. I mean, we would. My parents were always. My dad was always on a church in a church staff position. Um, in a Southern Baptist denomination, and so my mom would take. I mean, at times I would accompany her to wedding showers or baby showers. And there were certainly people of money in our church, but we were never those people.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
So but that just caught me out of the blue when she said that, because I didn't have that impression of myself, and because I was teaching at a metropolitan university in which I really did see poverty. I mean, I saw students who have to stop out a lot because they don't have the money to pay for their next semester.
Right.
I said, and then the pay of the support staff on the campus that hadn't had raises for years, because we're in a right to work state, right?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
so I saw, I said, and I told her, I said, here are the people that I see on an everyday basis. I understand that you're hanging with these other people, but we are well off in comparison to the everyday person in Arkansas, and probably most of the world,
Hmm.
in the US, but certainly other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, it's human nature, I think, to compare yourself to what's around, and then to react to it. We see it here. You know, we go to public schools, but there's schools here that's $70,000 a year to go to a private school, and
Yeah.
some of the kids who go there are like, have access to private jets.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. That don't have to ever worry about money. Uh-huh. And it's
Yeah,
not that those families didn't. I mean, one of the things that she learned was that the families themselves might not have come. They didn't. I mean, her peers might have had a silver spoon, right? But their the peers' parents worked hard to get where they were. They
yeah,
weren't
yeah,
always, so it wasn't like generational wealth,
yeah.
necessarily. In some cases, it was. And not everybody there had that kind of wealth, but the people that she, for some reason, hung out with did.
Right.
So,
Well, one of the things that I think, like, that is, I think it's good for people to be thinking about is, like, when we think about, like, kind of, diversity is such, like, almost a loaded word that I don't think it's that. I think it's just about kind of maybe more the breadth of exposure to different types of people. Is that there's so many different ways to kind of slice the, like, American society, right? I mean, you can slice it racially, but you can slice it socioeconomically, you can slice it regionally. And I think, like, I guess one of my objectives, like, with this podcast is, like, for myself, and I guess anybody who's listening or anybody participates, is, like, more just kind of thinking about all the different ways people are different, right? So, to me, like, one of the things, like, I mean, I want my kids to do is, like, I want you to be able to interact with the people who have a lot more than you, and I want you to be able to also interact and relate to people who have a lot less than you. And it's not just like, okay, if you can deal with people of different races but you can't do all that other stuff, then, like, are you really open-minded? Like, or maybe you are, but you can be even more open-minded. So I think, to me, it's one of those challenges, is the socioeconomic diversity that we get exposed to, and being able to deal with it in a way that I think a lot of times it does get framed in terms of, like, well, think you're better off than them, or you're not as good as them, and more just kind of being like, I am who I am, they are who they are, and I've got to be able to relate to them both ways.
exposure really does make a difference too, because if and this is one of the problems that we've got in our society today, is that we tend to be so siloed. I know
Yeah.
you had one of your podcast guests, Monica Guzman, who talks about, that we aren't curious enough to reach across the divide, whatever the divide might be.
Right.
And one of the reasons is because we hang with our people. So
Yeah.
who are my peeps? If my peeps are all like me, then that becomes a problem. I mean, I remember thinking about social media during the elections of 2016, 2020, and then with COVID, and thinking, I've got to make sure that I am clicking on multiple people's that have different perspectives than me. I remember, actually, a former a guy that I dated at once when I was in high school, and he actually made a comment on his social feed, Facebook feed, about, just check and see how many people are like you in your social feed. And I thought, well, that'd be interesting just to see in terms of political parties, and not everybody kind of acknowledges where they are politically, in their social feed. But I was able to find that I actually had a nice kind of combination of folks, so that I was reading feeds from different things, and it wasn't just all the algorithms just pointing me towards the one kind of persons. And that's just so important because we are not one identity. In the literature, in the academic literature, we call this um, intersectionality, which I'm sure you've heard of. But for me, that big term just means that I am not just one of my identities. So if a person looks at me and thinks, okay, she is just a woman, they're going to interact with me in one way. If they think she is just from Arkansas, they're going to interact with me like they're expecting me to be from whatever their stereotype is. If they think she's a college professor, they're going to maybe have lots of potential interactions. If they heard me say she grew up Southern Baptist, they're going to have some, an immediate reactions potentially. But until they get to know me and recognize that none of those identities frame who I am fully, all of them come together and intersect to define who I am, they won't really know me.
Yeah.
So if I am not exposed to a person beyond just that identity that I'm labeling them as, then I only react to them, think of them through that identity label and whatever the stereotypes are that I've been taught about that label.
Yeah. I wonder if that inclination to kind of like adhere to a label is, I mean, is it because we're afraid of showing we don't know something? It's like it's a lot easier to just see somebody and be like, okay, this is this, and act like versus kind of maybe proceeding in an engagement more cautiously to get to know them. Does that make any
It
sense? Like,
absolutely does.
uh,
There are it's a cognitive thing that happens in our brain that we don't even think about. I mean, people who study cognitive psychology, talk about this, and they talk about it um, in terms of cognitive complexity. And so there are ways of actually increasing our cognitive complexity. Children is an example of this. When you ask a child who's 6 years old, um, tell me about your best friend, they will maybe give you two or three words to describe that best friend. You continue asking them, they'll give you those same two or three words in multiple, kind of ways. You
is that
hope
like
that by the
asking a
time,
teenager how their day was and they say fine?
yeah, fine, right, right, yeah, well, there's that too. Um, if a person gets stuck at that
Hmm.
level and they don't begin to see people as being more diverse, nuanced, more perspectives, then they can still see the world. I feel like that I was that way for many, many years, and really until I took my first teaching job in Iowa, um, and started meeting people who blew my stereotypes out of the water. Okay. But I was really kind of I didn't have a lot of gray in my thinking. And
Hmm.
so I really saw people as a primary identity, and that's not something I'm proud of, but that's kind of in some ways it was my way of being able to, okay, I can communicate with you. Reduce the uncertainty. And people
Right.
talk about this in terms of reducing uncertainty. It takes a lot of time to get to know a person. And if I have fear of, I'm going to say something stupid or you're not going to understand me, then I'm going to try to figure out what it's like. What is going to be okay in that encounter with you if I'm going to interact with you. I can figure that out through watching you, observing you, and seeing you in different situations. That's where I start maybe getting a little bit broader perspective. I can figure that out by actually talking to other people about you. Okay, this is like, the first time you date somebody and try to figure out, looking at them from a distance, is this a good partner? Are they not? Um, and then, or I can actually interact with you and find out that you truly are who I expected or not. But if we stop at not doing any of those things, we're going to get stuck in our experiences. So I'll just give you an example, and this is maybe I don't want to take us down a rabbit trail too far if this is
Hmm.
not where you want to go, but one of my best friends in Iowa, and she's somebody that I ended up publishing with, um, is somebody that I was told I was waiting for my apartment to be ready, and so I was going to be able to stay with her. And a colleague of mine that I went to grad school with, who knew how conservative I was, um, she said, "Well, just know that everything in her house is going to be purple." That's one reason why I was looking at the purple of your shirt today. And I said, so purple? What in the world does that mean? She said, well, she publishes in the area of feminism, and all of a sudden my hackles went up. Okay, because feminism for me, I only knew through one perspective. Only what I had been told, what I would go home and listen to my mother listening to Rush Limbaugh calling them feminazis. Okay, and so I didn't. I'd never met a feminist before that I knew of, and so I'm like, I'm sure I had met some, but
Mhm.
nobody that had actually ever talked to me about what that was. So I was scared to meet her. When I found out, first of all, not everything in her house is purple,
Mhm.
but also that she was a wonderful human being that had her own nuanced intersections of identities, and that actually I could be a friend to her. I no longer thought of her as a feminist. I thought of her as a beautiful human being with lots of interesting things about her, things that actually I had some things in common with. So much so that by the time I left that university, I probably, although I still was considered myself conservative, I probably would consider part of my identity as being feminist. Now, I would never, ever have told my mother that because that would have created an argument. All right.
Mhm.
But women's rights are important. Okay. Do I have to support them and go march on the streets and burn bras? No. Do I have to, do all the stereotypes? No. I don't have to do that to still believe in, I want to support women. Okay. So, but I had no idea of that. That's why I said when I came, even, going to grad school, I still wasn't thinking outside the box enough. Um, and not until I met her did it really change my life. I mean, just in terms of being able to have conversations and understand that people are different than just the labels. And that began kind of to be one of the turning points in my life that um, helped me to start being curious.
Mm. Now, when you engaged her, did you like? You said she was roommates with you.
Well, just for like a month
Okay.
until I got my own apartment.
So
Yeah.
when you first started talking with her, was that like the first subject that came up, or was it more like everyday things? And when the subject of like feminism did pop up, was it something that she was very like strident about, or more like conversational about?
Well, no, we talked about our families first. We talked
Okay.
about her growing up. I'd see pictures of her family there, and I'm like, "Tell me about." I mean, you grew up in a family with lots of family. I'm like, "Looks like your mom and dad," and she was a wonderful cook, and so I had food, and I'm like, so, and then she would comment on things that I was wearing, and I'm like, okay. I mean, we were just having conversations that had nothing to do with. Now, I will say, I was put off by the plaque, and I did ask her about this, the plaque in her house that said, when God shuts a door, she opens a window, and the word she, and I'm like, ooh, okay. But I didn't immediately attach on to that. I just, and I realized afterwards and later that, a little bit more about her perspective. And the interesting thing is that both of us became more like each other. She actually ended up going to getting married to a pretty conservative guy and going to a more conservative church and embracing faith where she didn't have an active faith in that, when I first met her. And so, not that I had any influence on that. It's just that that's what happens when iron sharpens iron. It's like we get to know each other, and kind of some of that stuff kind of attaches sometimes if we want it to. It doesn't have to, but
Yeah.
that's what some people don't want that to happen. I don't want to
Right.
be like, I think that's what I found about this organization that I hadn't even mentioned called Braver Angels. It's like
Mhm.
I have become a more understanding and seeing more common ground with people that I thought I had nothing in common with because I've started interacting with them.
Yeah.
But it's not the first thing I have the conversation about.
Yeah, no, and for me, it was my friend is Eric Ireland, who was the first guest on the podcast, and he was through Brave Angels as well. But when I talked with them, like I was looking to speak with a Republican from South Carolina, and like we talked, and it was like, wait, this is not what I was expecting at all. And he'd been to New York City and he liked New York City, and I was just like, this is like, wait, like it's so different than I was prepared for, and I think once you start having that experience, I think it kind of opens up so many other doors. And I think that, I mean, in my perception of how like we've ended up where we are is that the powers that be, and this isn't like a conspiratorial thing or whatever, just more I think like the incentives and the way the systems are set up is that the people that have the power are incentivized to want to keep us in their camps. So they highlight the things that will make us stay with them. That's not good enough. They don't want us in the gray area. They want us as far over on the ledger as possible. So they highlight those differences, and they don't want us talking across that, because if we start talking, then all of a sudden they might lose a voter, or they might have voters that thinking more independently, and that's not what they want. And it's the same thing with like media companies. Like they want you watching, they want you clicking on their things, they want you watching their shows. The nuance and might me if everybody starts doing nuance, then they lose their consumers. So they need to be as radical as possible. And I call it like there's so much like cherry picking you could do. If you want to find craziness in this country, you can find it. I can go around. New York City's got 8 million people. There's plenty of insanity. There's plenty of other stuff too. But if you want to make New York City look bad, it's easy, you know. But you can do that for any place. And I think that if you're a politician, that's they seem to be brokering more in this idea of being scared of the other side, and that fear makes you less curious. That fear makes you not talk to those people. And I just think it's all. And I think it's all. I mean, it's bullshit. I just think it's all bullshit. I think there are people that are not good. There are evil. There is evil out there, but the large majority of people are all just trying to get by and aren't as dogmatic and don't really care as much about what you're doing as we think they are. Like, people
I
just want to be decent.
totally agree with you on that. And I do think that the incentive systems, both for our, the media institutions, as you were talking about, but the political institutions have led us down a road that's more polarized. I saw this in the most recent, elections last year with all the commercials that were happening in Arkansas. As I mean, and politics in Arkansas is a whole other topic, but we're a very red state, although I'm in a blue bubble in Little Rock, in a very red state. But when I began to start seeing the commercials becoming so far to the side of whatever their side was, and in the case in the case that I was watching or getting the commercials on, it was my side, right? So it's like, okay, so they are like arguing over who's the real conservative, and I'm like and almost like I'm more conservative than you. So as soon as you say that, that one who might be a little bit more moderate has to come to the right a little bit more, um, in order to the perception is to get their base. And I said to my husband one night, I said, if this is the way politics is, I don't like either one of these candidates because they're just throwing lobs at each other. I don't know what they stand for. And are they actually who do they consider to be their base? Can I not be considered to be their base? And he sat there and looked at me. He's like, oh, April, you're not their base. Their base is the far right. And I'm like, well, okay, but I should be part of their base. The person who might still not know which of them I'm going to vote for, I should still be, or if I'm going to vote for them or for the other side because I get irritated at them,
Mm-hmm.
I should still be part of their base.
Right.
Everybody should be part of their base. But
Yeah.
instead, they start, they can't really, they politic on things um, that are maybe more even conservative than they potentially are, or
Right.
more liberal than they are
Yeah.
because their base um, somehow is requiring that.
Right. Yeah, and if and if both sides are going to their extremes, then the people in the middle. I mean, if we give up altogether, that's fine. They don't care. Like the people who are in power,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you just dropped out. Okay, that's fine. It's just going to be our two camps warring, and that's where it just seems unproductive. The Yeah, the way I look at it, and I think this is at least how I'm perceiving anything that I'm hearing. Like, and I vote on the left. I actually also met. I met President Clinton when he was in Japan when I was in the Navy. I got to shake his hand. But I feel like politicians all broker in provide on platforms that leave their base blameless, burdenless, and they peddle in simple solutions. And it could be a wall to stop immigration. Like, that's it. We'll just build a wall. Like, it's simple. It's not your fault. We're just going to build this wall, and that's it. Versus like anything on the left where it's like, oh, we just need to eliminate racism and then everything gets better. Like, what does that mean? It's a simple little catchphrase, but what does that mean? So I feel like we need to be more. But I think what I'd say is I feel like people are also, we're the ones telling the politicians this we want to hear. Nobody wants to be told that they're part of the problem. Nobody wants to be told that here's a solution, but you're going to have to suck it up a little bit. They want other people to suck it up. They want other people to be inconvenienced. They don't want that themselves. And I think that's where we need to be more responsible and need to start seeing the collective responsibility that we all have to say,
yeah,
if you want to fix poverty if there's poverty everywhere, if there's poverty in Arkansas, or there's people that are really upset or disillusioned or disenchanted or feel disconnected from our society, that's our responsibility. It's not enough to just say, oh, that's too bad, they're just pissed off, or let's just throw money at them. They're that way, and they're us, and we need to take responsibility, and we need to say, what can I do to fix that? And it's not just money.
yeah. But sometimes I think we don't see ourselves as having the power to do that. There aren't systems that are set up to allow that to happen. So one of the classes that I teach here at the university is a class called Listening and Civil Dialogue, and one of the units in that, along with looking at kind of our intrapersonal biases and how we interpersonally can talk to each other in ways that are curious and respectful. We have a unit in that course in which I look at how do communities actually come together to deliberate and come up with solutions that come up from the ground level. If we rely just, I mean, we have a representative democracy, so I don't have a problem with the way that our country is set up in terms of we elect officials that will speak for us. But if we assume that those elected officials they are, we don't have to do anything, then
Right.
we lose the power. I mean, I
Right.
used to hear people say that if you don't vote, right, that you can't complain. Well, I also feel like that at times there are things at the local level that if we don't get involved in, or at the state level, that if we don't get involved in, we also have given up some power. But some areas have done a better job at that. So I bring in examples, not that I don't have. I have a couple in Arkansas as examples, but most of these are from other states in which groups of people have gotten together to try to solve a local or a community problem, like water, um, in a particular area, or land rights, like with Native Americans, or logging, or crime and perceptions of police in a particular local community. And those communities that have come together, they use dialogue and deliberation structures that, and what I use in my class when I talk about this is a model. I didn't create it, but it's a model in which we tend to have a lot of, in the middle, opportunity to work through discomfort. So you realize as you talk to each other, we have divergence. So you can kind of see, we may think we actually are more alike, but as we begin to talk to each other, our opinions become more divergent, and it's like almost you feel hopeless at that point. But you have to go through what the scholars call a chaos zone in the middle, where you feel like at times there's never going to come to come to any solution before you can actually get to convergence. What we sometimes do, and especially in like in a state like Arkansas, where the legislative branch and the executive branch are the same, um, political background, they don't have to pass laws. They don't have to get the constituencies who are not like them to buy in. It's better if they do, but they don't have to do that. They can avoid the chaos zone almost completely and say, okay, here are the two ideas. We're going, oh yeah, well that one's got a problem here, that one's got a problem here. We'll come up with this solution really quickly. We had a big education bill that came out that was in the first 100 days of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, our governor, her administration, called the LEARNS Act. Now, I understand from the background of that, from people who are actually on the ground level, that they did try to get some folks who were at the local level and educators and stakeholders like parents and others to be involved in some of the discussion. But the media didn't portray it like that at all. It portrayed it as the legislative, this was an executive legislative push to get it through as quickly as possible. It was a huge bill, lots and lots of pages, and boom, it was passed. Okay. Never did we understand that there were local level things going on. And not until I talked to somebody who's in our local Arkansas area from the Americans for Prosperity chapter, which is a more conservative chapter. And I talked to him at our national convention, Braver Angels convention recently. And he said, do you know some of the things that went on behind the scenes to actually get compromise to happen in that bill? I said, no, I didn't even know there was any compromise that happened, because the media, who was more bluish,
Mhm.
and the people that were kind of in my circle who were educators were posting negative things about this. And so I was hearing that side. And then I wasn't privy to the kinds of conversations, because I was taking that kind of perspective of, oh, it's the legislative, they're going to do whatever they want to do, because I wasn't involved. But he was on the ground level, bringing people together to talk about education from small communities, large communities, and began to tell me about some of the things that were not included in that, some of the things that were changed in it. And I'm like, that makes me feel so much better. Because if we don't do that, if we don't have to do it at the legislative and executive branch, and if our people aren't stepping up, including myself, our individual citizens aren't stepping up to actually be involved in the discussion, or we don't see an opportunity to, all we see is letters to the editor or calls to our congressperson, which are all important things to do, but we don't see any decision making that's involving us, then we sit back as passive.
Right.
So long kind of thought about what you were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'd love to continue going on this path, but one thing I was been wondering about is, like, for you, in Little Rock, what's a perfect day for you?
Oh gosh, a perfect day for me. Now I'm a 12-month employee, so
Uh-huh.
perfect day for me. It's hard. Do I say it should include my work, or it doesn't include my work?
No, let's just say you have a
So
day. I'm going to get you out of keep you out of trouble with work. It's your day
okay,
off.
thank you, thank you. Okay, I appreciate that, because I would love to talk about my days off. Okay,
Yeah.
so a perfect day for me is so a day off would be time in which I would be out in nature or exploring some history. Those are two things that my husband and I have very different interests. We realized that when we first got married, and so we had to figure out what are things that we have in common, right? That we both love, and we both love hiking and nature and being able to see the beautiful things. It's one thing. It's one of the reasons why I love living in Arkansas. Um, you can go in the state of Arkansas within 2 hours of anywhere from Little Rock and find different kinds of landscapes. So you can go and find rich delta land where it's kind of more flat, and you'll see lakes and rivers running through, but cotton growing, right, rice growing. soybeans, corn, even, which I didn't think. I'm like, corn, that's Iowa, because that's what
Yeah.
I felt like. But and then you could go 2 hours in another direction, or even less than that, and like we did over this weekend, and go up to the second highest point in Arkansas, which was Queen Wilhelmina State Park in Mena, and you're in the mountains. Now, it's not the mountains like the Smokies or the Rockies, but it's mountains where it's 10 degrees cooler, which in the summertime, that's beautiful when it's 90 or 100 degrees here. And so that's my ideal day, is to be out among, and then getting to just see the everyday people. I mean, when we were there this weekend and we were talking about this, it's like, in fact, I said to him, I said, oh, I'm not looking forward to going back to the concrete.
Hmm.
And he's like, I know what you mean, because we live in a city of concrete.
Hmm.
Little Rock has some beautiful parks, and um, the river runs through it, and we have Pinnacle Mountain. But for the most part, it's not a walkable city. We don't have great public transportation. It's not a great biking city, although there are some biking trails. Some people would argue with me and say, "Oh my gosh, she has it wrong." I have one of my colleagues that bikes all over, and he would just say, "Oh no, there's the problem with biking and walking for me is it's hilly.
Hmm. Hmm.
I
Yeah.
don't I'm not that kind of biker.
Yeah.
Okay, I like easy biking, so that's
Right.
the problem. But yeah, so and I love the hilliness. But that's a perfect day, is to get out and see things. But it also could be that I'm going to go and see something that I hadn't seen before. So maybe I'm going to go down to Garvin Gardens and Hot Springs and see their botanical gardens. I mean, their outside gardens, because it's a certain time of year. Or maybe it's that I'm going to go explore a particular part of history that I hadn't known before. So when we chose Mena as an example of where we were going, it's like, why did we choose that? I said, it's a small town. I wanted to kind of get the feel of that, but also there's history around the railroad, and why it came through, and the pioneers who settled in that area, and we can learn some of the history of why things were set up that way. So to me, I can find that anywhere, history and nature, within walking distance almost of um, of Little Rock. So
Hmm. Um, why does Little Rock have the name Little Rock? Speaking of history, is there
yeah, there
some
is,
rock?
and so it's Petit Rocher,
Hmm.
which is French. So there's a small rock formation on the Arkansas River that's called La Petite Rocher,
Hmm.
and because it was originally kind of a river traffic area. Um, and there is another rock across the river. There is a large bluff that some people call the Big Rock, but Little Rock was actually built on that smaller rock formation
Okay.
around the Arkansas River.
And what's the relationship between, like, you have Kansas and then you have R Kansas? What's the R? What's the significance of that name?
I have no idea. I should look that up. I don't know.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't brief you on what I might be asking questions.
No,
These are just kind of
no.
hitting me as we talk.
Yeah. I
Um,
don't know the answer to that. So
and then how would you distinguish? Like, is there a cultural difference between like people from Arkansas and like somebody from like Missouri, like, or like, can you just tell and how people are, and not looking for stereotypes, but see, this is where it's also like, it's kind of like, we don't have stereotype, but people, I think one of the things we've lost sight of is that we all are kind of reflective of like where we are, where we grow up. And I use the wine concept of terroir. So like, if you're a New Yorker, it doesn't mean you should limit somebody or expectations of somebody based on, oh, they're from here, so they have to be like this. But there are certain things that you probably just kind of start defaulting to because that's what works best in your setting or in
okay.
your circle. So I
So
don't mean to stereotype, but
my first response was, yes, I can tell the difference because they have a different accent.
oh,
That was my first
really?
response.
Really?
But not a lot of difference. And it really, though, to me, it depends on um, rural versus urban more
Hmm.
than anything.
Hmm.
I think there is so much difference in Missouri also, with this. Iowa, same way. Arkansas, Oklahoma. I mean, probably all the states. If you live in a rural area, you have a lot more opportunities to hunt, to fish, to just live on the land. Um, Urban area, it's the time. You're faster pace, and so we pick up those things from our geography where we are. I would, the interesting thing is that there are certainly sports teams differences. Razorback fans versus Tiger fans. Is that right? Is it Missouri
Missouri,
Tigers? I
I think.
think.
Yeah.
So I would say you're not going to find a more loyal base than the Razorbacks. People would probably disagree with me, but my only evidence of that
Mhm.
um, is how they follow their teams, whether they win or lose.
Mhm.
And they're not fair weather fans.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that Missouri's aren't, but loud and obnoxious you will find everywhere in all fan bases.
Yeah.
But I would say that you'll find that here as well, and people who really follow and would say they're lifelong Razorbacks from wearing all kinds of red and anyway, that was not your answer.
No,
Your
no.
question originally, is there a difference between Missouri and Arkansas? Not that I would necessarily say yes. There's just a huge difference.
Uh,
We are more at the South,
mhm.
so Missouri is more Midwest, and I spent many years in the Midwest. I found it to be nice people, and would do anything for you. In the South, what I sense more in Arkansas that people are more comfortable with. Not all Arkansans, but perhaps because we have more minority population that grew up around with the importance of religion. But we are part of the Bible Belt. But that Bible Belt, I always thought of that as being a very white thing. So
Mhm.
when you hear me connecting it to potentially to poor slavery kinds of connections with minorities, there's also a real tradition of conservatism and Bible Belt. Um, and so, I mean, I grew up where my parents. I mean, I went to churches in which the you were told how to vote based on a couple or three issues, and
Mhm.
so that was be concerned the Bible Belt in terms of what I think people typically think of it. But I think of it now because I live in Arkansas, I live in Little Rock. I oftentimes will have students that will just end a conversation with, and they're typically Black or African American students, with "Have a blessed day." And what they mean by blessing is a religious kind of connotation. Um, or I prayed about this, or they'll bring in God to the conversation. In Iowa, when I moved to Iowa, that is like nobody would talk about God. And so
Mhm.
there's a real sense of also, and not that all people do this. I would say that a lot of people I hang with are not comfortable with bringing up the name of any God.
Mhm.
um, and so, but I have sensed that since I've moved back here, is that people are much. I don't have to apologize as much as I would have used to in the
Mhm.
North about being a person of faith.
Mhm. And the stereotype for me for people from the Midwest is that they're a little bit more reserved.
They are more
So
reserved.
maybe that would be where that doesn't come out. And like the interesting thing you're raising is I spoke to a woman in before you, that episode's not out yet, but it was a black woman from Georgia, and she had said that in many respects, like we're talking about like this kind of perception in the North that there's racism in the South, and black people aren't welcome. And she said, like in many respects, as a black person, there is a lot of common culture with white people in the South. One, they've lived alongside each other for a lot longer than maybe in many of the cities. But she also said like there is that religiosity, and she mentioned family reunions, which is not something I'm very familiar with in the South. But she mentioned like those two things as being something that like white Southerners do, just like black Southerners do. Whereas like in the white Northerner can't relate on those substantive areas.
Just got back from family reunion, the
Oh, is
family
that
reunion that
right?
we've had for years on
Really?
my dad's side. Yep, yep, and we still get together even after the primary people. I mean, we did it every year. Yeah, and
That's funny.
I don't know anything different than that.
Yeah, we that does not definitely doesn't happen, and at least not
We
just around
sing
my
together, we
circle.
eat together, we play together. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but and I guess like what I'd say, like from the perspective like of my experience is like you were talking about being like dreading going back to the cement of the city. Where I had the opposite experience during in the early parts of the pandemic when like New York City was like shut down, like there was nothing, like the schools were closed, the playgrounds were locked up. I mean, it was my family of five in our 1,100 square foot apartment, and
Oh,
after like being here for X number of weeks, we're like we need to change the setting, like just for our own sanity, we need to go someplace. So we found a house in Buffalo, which is really far away from New York City. It was like a good 6-8 hour drive, but we got it because there was this nice like 5 acres of lawn. It was a house. It was in like the country, and what we found out is like our kids are city kids. Like they didn't like the insects. They stayed inside. They played video games. When we came back and we drove back, the second they started seeing the cement, they were like, "Thank God we're home."
interesting, interesting. Well, and
So
I will say that I love the shopping. I love the opportunities that we have, a variety of kinds of, I mean, Mina versus Little Rock, and nothing to diss Mina, but Main Street. I mean, there just wasn't very much shopping to
yeah,
do. There's no malls, there's no Target. They have a Walmart, which, by the way, is one of the
uh,
things Arkansas is known for.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so yeah, I do think that, but there are advantages in all of those areas.
yeah,
Sometimes my husband and I just like to drive up to Mountain Home and just sit around and hear the people pick and pick and chew. The bluegrass folk just playing their guitars and singing, and there's just a slower part. It
sure,
just feels slower. It's like people can breathe,
yeah.
as opposed to rush, 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 rush.
Yeah,
So
no, to me that I guess it's almost the point is that what we need to do is be able to understand that different things work for different people.
yeah, that's
Like
true.
I mean, for me, I like the city because I feel like it. I think I'm an introvert by nature, but I don't like being like holed up. So like having a city of 8 million people right outside my doorstep gives like it kind of it forces me to deal with people, in a good way, and I feel better for that. We like going to having lots of different neighborhoods. Is New York City crazy? Is it kind of like can waiting on a subway platform when it's like 100 when it feels like it's 110 degrees and you're waiting for 10-15 minutes, yeah, that's not pleasant. But like this morning I woke up and I rode my bike over the Brooklyn Bridge and then along the Hudson River, and finished up by the Intrepid and then rode back down, and that's great. And there's good and there's bad, and I think that maybe what we should all be doing, I guess that's the point of the podcast here, is like kind of understand that people should find their happy place wherever it is, and we need to kind of like respect that, but then also respect that they might be different than us, and we should look for all the commonalities before we just focus on the differences and be like, oh my god, why do you like bluegrass is awful, hip hop is the way to go, or whatever. Like, are you happy? Good, that's what matters. And if I'm
Yeah,
happy and you're
yeah.
happy, then we've got a happy country.
Yeah, but even just being able to, I mean, if you and I had a longer conversation, if we were actually sitting across from each other at a coffee shop, I would want to know more about what drew you to the city. Why, and how did you get used to it? Because 8 million people riding a subway sounds overwhelming to me.
My
Um,
kids do it,
and
my daughter
yeah,
does
well,
it.
see, which is amazing. But that's because they're used to that, and I think they wouldn't have been used to it if they hadn't grown up in that.
Right.
But everybody has a story. And if we can take the time to listen to people's stories, like you're doing in your podcast, and on the series, then we begin to realize, oh, I just I just need to listen to that person's story who
Yeah.
might be different than me. I may never. choose to move to New York City, but I can see how they could value that. Oh, yeah, I could see that that would be cool.
Yeah, right. Or now, the one thing we were talking about communication, that's your specialty. One of the things I noticed is like in the New York City school curriculum, and I don't know if it's like this for everywhere, but I think that a lot of the discussion about civic engagement is all about finding your voice. There's a lot about talking. There's a lot about protesting. There's a lot about whatever, but there's really nothing about listening, and listening is so important, because if we're all only told that we should be talking and yelling and protesting and whatever, then we're just shouting, we're not listening. And I think there needs to be a lot more of a premium in the education system for everybody, everywhere, everybody across the political spectrum, on listening. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on to why we've so de-emphasized listening?
I have some thoughts about that. I do think that sometimes it seems like such a simple skill that um, we just kind of dismiss it. I was doing a conflict management workshop to some staff this week, a 3 series workshop that I did, and we were talking about listening. And I said, something as simple as paraphrasing back what you hear somebody say, we take for granted because we think, well, why do I need to do that? But that slows down the conversation enough to where they feel like that they're really heard. Um, I know for me personally, and I can't speak for everybody in terms of why we avoid listening. There's a couple of reasons why I would say personally, if I don't choose to listen. Why? One is I don't want to learn. I'm not curious about whatever it is they're saying. I've already dismissed it out of hand. So why would I need to? I think they're wrong. I hate to say that I would think that, but if I'm really not embracing that mindset of curiosity, then that could be one of the reasons why I'm choosing to. Why do I need to? They're not worth my time of day. So there's sometimes that internal kind of bias that we need to unearth to say what is it that's going on inside of me that makes me think that. Where did I learn that about that kind of person that I don't even want to interact with them? I think another reason that for me that I don't listen sometimes is I'm just too busy, right? So I am wanting to solve problems. So I think I see this with my kids, right? For me, and even though they're adult children now, if they come to me with, "Mom, I'm still having struggles with whatever this is," I go into problem solving mode
Right.
almost immediately
It's like with your
because
spouse too.
I want to solve the problem. I want to make their life better. I want to fix it. And sometimes, thankfully, they will say to me, "Mom, I just need you to listen." Okay. So it's like oh, not problem solve. So one of the things I said this week in that workshop was before we ever, especially in what I would call wicked problems or intractable problems, problems that have had a history, problems that have been difficult over time, problems that have real strong emotions connected to them, um, problems that could be solved in many different ways. In any of those kinds of problems, I need to understand where the other person's coming from before I ever try to fix the problem. I used to say to my mom, as she got older, I would have this commute into when I was living in Iowa, 30 minutes from the small town to the university city. And she would call me and I finally, she would always give me advice. And I finally, I'm like, that's just a pattern we've gotten into over time. And I think it's a mother-daughter thing, but I was, gosh, in my 50s, like, okay, she's still giving me advice. That's fine. Um, but I finally said to her one day, I said, "Mom, I, I need to sometimes just tell you what's going on without you fixing it. I just need you to listen." But she was never taught how to do that. So I think we also sometimes lack the skills um, to do that. In my department, and kind of promise what is applied communication, where communication that you go out into the community and you make a difference is basically applied communication. So it's not just civic engagement in the sense of I'm going out and advocating for my rights, for the rights of others. but it's actually collaborating with others to make it a better place. So our mission statement that sits on the back wall of my department, so that all of us remember it. It's in all of our syllabi. My students, by the time they graduate, they know it. They could tell you. We're at an award ceremony last spring, and I said, "So what is the mission of our department?" And they just started saying it. To foster, that means that I can only do part of it. I'm trying to foster the co-creation. Co-creation means it requires me working with other people. The co-creation of better social worlds. I think that probably is explanatory. It's what you're trying to do. We're trying to make it better for all of us through positive communication. Now, positive communication, when I first saw that mission and I was thinking about taking the job here, I'm like, oh, that's just Pollyannish. That's just politeness. But positive communication isn't just politeness. It's actually, I am going to enter into the willingness to have a difficult conversation, to embrace discomfort, to actually say more than anything, I want to build a relationship with you. I may not like you by the end. I may never have a close relationship, but I want to communicate in ways that shows that you are valued as a human being. So to foster the co-creation of better social worlds through positive communication, that inherently involves listening.
That's yeah, that's perfect. And this would launch us into another whole episode, which I wish we had time to do. But I think that sounds like a great way to, I guess, kind of wrap this up. But can I ask, before we do actually wrap it up, can I ask what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Yeah, I have heard some of your other episodes, so I knew you were going to ask this question, and I thought about it a couple of different ways. One is my simple answer is what gives me hope is the everyday people. I really believe that most of us, I don't believe that for the most part that there are evil people. I think most of us are well intentioned. We may not go about our lives in the same way, but we believe that humanity is good and that we have the right to be on this earth together. Now, I granted there are people that haven't done that historically, that don't do that currently, but most of us do. I go back in my head to the story of when I broke down. I'm in the middle of nowhere between Arkansas and Oklahoma. I had to literally drive my car like 20 miles an hour into this small town that I had never been, right on the edge of Oklahoma and Arkansas. Um, and what happened when I got in that town? Somebody saw me broken down by the side of the road. Here I am, a single person. I I'm scared as heck because there still back then were crime shows that showed that you might really
What
could get
happens? Yeah,
attacked, right?
yeah.
Um, and this person comes up in his pickup truck and he says, "Do you need help?" And I said, "Absolutely. I don't know this person from Adam." He said, "It's a Sunday, so no places are open." He says, "What's going on with your car?" I tell him. He says, "Well, I have a friend that's a mechanic. He would open up his shop, and I needed a whole engine replacement. A
Oh my
whole
god.
engine replacement. Dang it, seriously? And I got to get back to school. I was going from Arkansas to Oklahoma to get back to school, and I'm like, what do I do? I don't think at that point I probably didn't have a credit card. I don't think there were cell phones. I mean, this was some years ago. And he said, so I'm like, what do I do? Where do I stay? I was thinking all this. He says, don't worry about any of this. He's like, I'm going to take care of getting this. This person has access to this used car. They can access to this place that probably has motors. I bet there can be a motor. And I just bet he can get that fixed for you tomorrow. And I'm like, seriously? And he says, and oh, by the way, don't worry about it. I'm going to call my girlfriend and you can stay at our house tonight. And I'm like, dang, is this safe? What can I do? Now, that is the American way. That is the way that people, and now maybe if I hadn't been white, maybe if, I mean, I don't know. I can't judge whether that would have happened to other people because I have some privilege because of who I am. But that is what gives me hope. And most recently, I've seen that hope in this organization called Braver Angels, in which I have been, because of the pandemic, able to meet people from all across the United States via Zoom, and then most recently in person at our national convention, um, that have all different kinds of opinions, that on their Facebook page will post things that I am diametrically opposed to. But when we get to talk to each other in person, we say our relationship is more important than our difference. And your humanity is more important than whether I agree or disagree with you. And that is what gives me hope. It's that everyday grassroots people that I really believe if I got in a bind today in the state of Arkansas or maybe driving through New York, I'd be praying like heck that somebody safe would find me. But I think there would be people that would help me
Yeah. Well, you got a phone
because,
number for somebody in New
yeah.
York, so.
Well, now I got a cell phone. I can call somebody to help in AAA. I mean, but back then, not the
Yeah.
same. Yeah.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And to the idea of like posting on Facebook, I think I have my mind, and because of Brave Angels and other things, I post sometimes, and I'll see the people that like my posts, and I'll be like, this is one person who I know is on the far left, and then there's somebody who's on the far right, and they both like what I posted. So I think that, and these are things where I'm expressing an opinion about something, and I think there's a way to like for each of us to do that, and I think for us as a society to kind of move more in that direction. And it's great to
Yeah.
hear about all that hope and energy that you have from what you've seen, and far broader exposure to this matter. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And thank you for inviting me. I originally, when you reached out, I was like, well, what do I have to offer him? But we each have unique experiences, and I appreciate you on letting me share some of mine.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. Thank you so very much, April. Take care.
Thank you.